Susan Thompson, and I'm Professor of Planning at UNSW, and I'm also an Associate Director of the City Futures Research Centre. And in the centre, I chair the Postgraduate Working Group, and the working group is behind today's seminar, bringing some of our wonderful postgraduate students to present to us today. I have a great pleasure and responsibility to acknowledge country, the country that we are on today, many of us on different country. I'm here on the border of the Gadigal and Wongal lands of the Eora Nation, and I often use this beautiful image of a mural which is on the border of the Gadigal and Wongal lands. And for me, very much a testament to the ways in which our First Nations people have looked after place since the beginning of time. So thank you so much for everyone coming along today, and thank you particularly to our postgraduate students who will be presenting. And I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Charlie Gillen, who will facilitate today's presentations and warmly welcome you as well. So thanks very much, Charlie.
Great. Thank you, Susan. So for those who haven't met me before, my name is Dr. Charlie Gillen, and I'm a research associate at City Futures. I'm also on the postgraduate working group, so I'm here in that capacity this afternoon. The postgraduate working group is comprised of myself, Susan, Matt Ng, and Ali Buxton, and we're sort of working behind the scenes to support postgraduate students in the centre and to give them a bit of a platform and a bit of a showcase in their current work, and also thinking about different ways that we can support students to launch them into their careers post-study. I'm very excited. It's a privilege today to have 3 of our City Futures students present to us on their current research projects. Yunzheng Zhang, Rana Shakaa, and Harvey. So I'll introduce them all in turn, and then we'll get underway. So we'll begin with Yunzheng today. So she's supervised by Professor Hazel Easthope and Dr. Chris Martin at City Futures. If I could ask you, Yunzheng, now to share your screen.
Charlie.
The title of Yunzheng's talk today is China's Employee Housing Assistance in the Post-Reform Era, a Welfare Pluralist Typology. The floor is yours, Yunzheng. You've got about 15 minutes, and then we'll have question and answer time for each presentation in sequence. So all yours, Yunzheng. We're looking forward to hearing from you about your PhD.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, in today's presentation, I will introduce some housing assistance provided through employers in China's post-reform era. My presentation includes background, new typology of housing assistance for employees, and some ongoing interviews. Let's see the background first. Internationally, employer-assisted housing exists in many corners of the world. As early as in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were company towns built in the UK, Germany, and the US. In those early industrialized countries, workers were housed by their employers in the company towns. Similarly, in China's planned economy era, Chinese urban spaces was organized by danwei compounds. Danwei compounds were the workplaces and the residential spaces for urban residents. In the contemporary era, housing directly provided by employers is not that common. However, some employers are also trying to house their employees. For example, in the US, the University of California system has its employee housing schemes. I also found that there are some Australian tax policies for employer-assisted housing. So I guess maybe some Australian employers also house their workers. And let's see China's changing danwei housing. China's socialist employer is always called danwei in the planned economy era. At that time, the employer, the danwei, was the governing unit of the state's power. The housing was planned by the state, and the danwei was responsible for allocating housing to urban residents. And in 1978, China initiated its market-oriented reform, and the state had gradually withdrawn from housing provision, and market actors was introduced. The danwei had more autonomy in addressing its housing problems. And in 1998, a comprehensive housing reform took place, and the housing allocation through danwei was terminated. The dual-track housing system consisting of public housing provided by the state and commodity housing provided by the market has been formed. And there's also a shift of the focus of China's subsidized housing policies in the contemporary era. In 2011, China's subsidized housing policy was targeted mainly at low-income people. However, in 2021, Chinese government has recognized the housing problems faced by new citizens and the young population. The younger generation of migrant population are always well educated and skilled. They move to big cities to pursue their career. However, their income is not as high as that of the local housing prices. Previously, subsidized housing was provided mainly by governments. However, Chinese governments has tried to get social power involved in subsidized housing provision. Here, social power refers to social actors like developers, employers, and other social organizations. This reflects China's ideological shift from welfare state to welfare pluralism, which means multiple actors may take the responsibility of providing subsidized housing. And employer-assisted housing is also a type of housing provided by social power. It reflects both the employer's business arrangements and the local government's subsidized housing strategy. A survey conducted by Professor Xin Qiao at Peking University shows that local funds are usually inadequate for constructing subsidized housing. So at least half of the number of subsidized housing reported by local governments is made up of housing for state enterprises and corporate employees. To encourage social actors to get involved in providing subsidized housing, some land policies have been made. And for the employers, they are allowed to build subsidized housing on vacant land owned by themselves or land in industrial parks. In summary, in the planned economy era, the China socialist employers provided housing, while in the current period, employers provide both financial assistance and housing. And also, employer-provided housing can be categorized into both state-led housing and market-led housing systems. So from my perspective, it can be regarded as the middle ground between state-led housing and market-led housing. And I will introduce a few types of housing assistance provided through employers. The first two types are financial assistance. The first one is Housing Provident Fund, which means the employer and the employee should deposit a certain percentage of money to a particular bank account. This idea was borrowed from Singapore's Central Provident Fund scheme. And in this scheme, the state is a major decision maker because this is a mandatory scheme, and the employer determines the percentage of the Housing Provident Fund, and it is also a major funder. The second type of housing assistance, financial housing assistance, is housing subsidies. This is widely adopted for many employers around the world. Some employers may offer rental subsidies or down payment to help their employees access housing. In this type of assistance, the state is a regulator and the employer play the key role. And then I will introduce a few types of housing provided through employers. The first type is talent worker housing. It is usually led by the government and implemented by market developers. Employers are allocated government-provided talent worker housing, and they can rent it to employees. From the picture, this shows a talent worker housing project in Shenzhen. It is provided by regenerating old urban villages in Shenzhen's urban areas. In this type of housing, the state is a key decision maker, a planner, and a major funder. The market is a decision maker because it decides whether to join the construction of this type of housing or not. And it is also a major funder because it invests a lot. The employer only plays an intermediate role in the allocation of talent worker housing. The second type is group buying housing. Rather than regarding it as a type of housing assistance, it can be mainly considered as a type of market strategy. The developer can reach an agreement with the employer to reserve several housing units and sell them to employees at a discount price. In this type of housing, the state plays a supervisory role. The market is the key decision maker and a major funder, while the employer only plays an intermediary role because it doesn't directly invest in housing. The third type is employer-provided dormitories and rental housing. This is a common type of housing assistance provided by employers. And in previous literature, scholars usually focus on dormitory labor regime. They focus on housing dormitories provided by low-skilled workers and rural to urban migrants. This type of housing is also offered for fresh graduates by some large companies. I interviewed several residents living in employer-provided dormitories. Their attitudes are diverse. An interview says his employer provides him with a dormitory room, but he needs to share inside this type of arrangement because he wants to have independent space. Another resident says living in employer-provided dormitory enables him to socialize with his colleagues, but the rental price can be easily affected by the economic performance of the company. In this type of housing, the state plays a regulatory role, and the market is only an implementer because it is only responsible for the constructing work, and the employer is a key decision maker. It determines whether to get involved in providing housing or not. And it is also a major funder for this type of projects. And also for employer-provided dormitories, there are some regulations set by the governments. For example, a government interviewee told me that if an employer wants to build dormitories on industrial lands, then the housing size should not exceed a certain standard because industrial land is cheap and residential land is much more expensive. If the employer builds lots of housing on industrial lands, then the market developers who need to build housing on residential land will have lower profits. The next type of housing assistance is cooperative housing. Employer-involved housing cooperatives include employer-employer cooperatives, employer-employee cooperatives, and employer-developer cooperatives. The last one is more common compared with the other two. An example is the Zhilian Car Town in Guangzhou. This housing project is constructed by a local car company and 4 other local real estate companies. In this type of housing, the state plays a regulatory role, while the market and the employer play more important roles. They are the major decision makers and funders. The last type is self-constructed housing of employers. Some employers may set up subsidiary companies to build housing for their employees, and the underlying organizational structure of this type of housing is quite simple compared with cooperative housing. In the provision of this type of housing, the state is a regulator and a planner because this type of housing is usually incorporated into the public housing system. And the employer is a major decision maker, major funder, and implementer. The market plays no role in this type of housing. In the past month, I've conducted some interviews with participants. I interviewed some key actors, a developer who involved in a cooperative housing project told me this type of project is beneficial for them because the buy side is guaranteed. However, another developer who played a secondary role in that cooperative housing project said this project was not that beneficial for them because it couldn't bring them lots of profits. And I also interviewed government officials and urban planners. They told me if employers want to build housing for their employees, then they should set up subsidiary real estate companies or cooperate with real estate companies to meet the qualification requirements, because only companies with the qualifications can carry out housing development. I also interviewed several residents living in employer-assisted housing. I mainly interviewed people living in cooperative housing. An interviewee said the neighborhood relationship is good in that housing compound because most of the residents are colleagues and know about each other. Also, another resident says, although the housing compound is far away from the city center, but he doesn't think this is a big problem because the commuting time between his home to his workplace is quite short. This is different from other subsidized housing in China because there are also other subsidized housing led by by the government and the developers. They are usually located in suburban areas. People complain about that because they are far away from their workplaces. I also learned some lessons from my field work and from participant recruitment. For the interview, I found that recruiting residents through social media is easier compared with stopping a stranger and trying to talk with him on the street. And key actor interviewees are also not willing to be recorded because of privacy concerns. I'm also conducting a survey on employees' living experience in employer-assisted housing. However, the samples are very concentrated because most respondents live in employer-provided rental housing or dormitories. To avoid invalid responses, I send the survey to potential participants identified through social media. I read their social media posts and try to identify who lived in employer-assisted housing and send the survey link to them. However, the response rate is quite low. This is the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening. I'd greatly appreciate your feedback.
Thank you so much, Yunzheng, for your presentation. It was great and to time. I'm very interested to hear from the audience any questions or perhaps comments about some of the methodological challenges and insights that Yunzheng has just shared. If people online have questions, feel free to put their hands up. I see there's a question in the chat if no one has any urgent questions from Susan. Susan, would you mind putting on your camera and just speaking to the question? That would be great.
Yeah, no, I thank you very much. A very interesting presentation. And I was just thinking as you were speaking, I'm wondering if housing provision is going to become more important and an increasing part of the sort of employees' salary package, given that we do have a very competitive job market. And I mean, I think this is global. Do you think this will become part of that salary package more and more, or is it too early to tell?
Do you mean providing terms of housing assistance or monetary form of housing assistance for employees?
No. Well, perhaps both. Yeah, perhaps both. Yeah. The whole thing of housing assistance for employees, so an additional part of their salary package.
Additional part.
And yeah, extra salary. So to attract workers.
But actually, in the cases that I study, the employer make housing provision as a part of the salary package. For example, if a person receives $100,000 each year, then he can get no housing assistance. But if he agrees to receive a lower salary standard, then he will be provided with housing assistance.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Are you able to hear me there?
Yeah, Charlie, there's another question.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Because I had a question about the respondents, because I can imagine that if I was in company-provided housing, I'd be worried about being fired because as well as losing my job, I'd lose my house. So I think that would make me nervous about asking for a pay rise in case I lost my job and my house. And it might make me nervous about responding to surveys as well, in case the company found out and they were upset with me because I'd said something negative in the survey. So I'm wondering two things. One is, do you find that the employees get the housing are paid much less? In other words, the companies that offer the housing, do they pay their staff less by more than the difference of the cost of the housing? Because no one wants to ask for a pay rise. And is there a way in your survey you can make sure that respondents feel comfortable that they won't be identified and get into trouble for saying something? Because I noticed all the responses that your respondents gave, all the residents' responses, they were all positive. Nobody had a grumble, which is a bit unusual, I thought.
Do you mean in the survey, some respondents may not willing to show their opinions because they are not willing to show the information of their employers?
Yeah, they might think they get identified and then lose the house.
Actually, I experienced this problem when I send the survey link to those working in the government sectors. They were not quite willing to join the survey. But when I send a link to those working in private companies, they were more willing to take part. So for those working in the state sector, I just send the survey to my acquaintances and ask them to help me deliver the survey.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard, for your question. I see there's a question online from Andrew that is quite similar to Richard's question. So thanks, Andrew, for the question. I hope that Yunzheng has answered that one for you. In the interest of time, I'll move on to our next speaker. So thank you very much, Yunzheng. Our second speaker is Rana Shakaa. So Rana, if you could share your screen and take the floor. Rana is a PhD candidate supervised by Hazel Easthope and Dr. Lawrence Kimmel, and her presentation is titled Knowledge, Power and Subjectivity in the Making of Private Art, the Case of the City of Sydney. If everyone could just turn off their videos while one person is presenting, that would be fantastic. Rana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlie, for the introduction. It's my pleasure to take part in the symposium today. And yes, I'm working on a project about public art making, and I would like actually to introduce my topic through a story very known in the literature as the story of Tilted Arc, a name of a public artwork by renowned artist Richard Serra. So in 1981, the US federal government requested the artist to create a public artwork in the Federal Plaza of Manhattan in the US. And apparently, the government wanted something beautiful to activate the plaza, something that would attract the public to come and use the space. So the artist responded to the government invitation by creating this tilted arc that you could see on the left side of the slide. And the government did not like the artwork, and they decided to remove it and replace it by something else. For them, it's not reflecting their objectives and visions. It is not aesthetically appealing, and it obstructs the pedestrian movement. But from the artist's perspective, public art is not necessarily beautiful. It's not necessarily something functional, and it's not necessarily something that has to engage everyone in the space. And most important, that its role is not to reflect the government vision, but perhaps to critically reflect on the different environmental, social, and political issues in cities. And this story actually explains why art historians and critiques usually they argue against the institutionalization of public art. I mean by that, the involvement of the government in the commissioning of public art, which is actually upsurging since the 1980s, when public art become advocated in academic circles as a contributor to urban renewal. So researchers argue that within the context of urban renewal, public art is beneficial to cities in cultural, social, economic, and aesthetic terms. And we're all familiar with those notions that actually promote creativity in creating spaces, such as creative class, creative cities, and more recently, creative placemaking. So from the perspective of art historians and critiques, the problem with institutionalized public art is that it sets conditions and constraints on public art practice. And the problem here, what will be missed from the city spaces is the art participation in creating forms and meanings that are more radical by virtue of art nature as a creative practice. So what we will be seeing in the public domain is not a critical radical art, but something that could be maybe beautiful or just functional and perform what the government what's the government political agenda or vision. So through my study, I decided to study the conditions of public art and to look at the conditions and to ask whether this integration of public art with city building processes, does it make the public art in our public domain a practice, a disciplined practice with predetermined outcomes, or we do allow for creativity within these processes? But before I move on also, I think that there is other thing that deserves our attention in the story of Tilted Arc. Even though the government managed to remove the artwork, I think that the fact that the outcome was far away from what the government was looking for. I mean, this Tilted Arc was put in place for several years. It means that the artist agency over the work, when he made this artwork, was also dominant in the process. So this means that if we seek to understand the meanings given to public art, the subjective practices, they also deserve to be examined apart from the institutional arrangements or the processes that are established by the governments. And that's why I draw in my study on Michael Foucault, who understands power as relative and diffused as opposed to concentrated. And he's someone who accounts for subjectivity. He believes that as individuals, we always have the opportunity to reduce the dominant disciplinary effects of power over us. So in the context of this study, power is not only embodied in the institutional practices, but it is also manifested in the thoughts and practices of the actors who are involved in the process of making public art. And I think that the city of Sydney is a very relevant and interesting case to examine public art making, because the recognition of public art in the city of Sydney is a substantive recognition in which public art is supported by a strategic vision of its potential and how this might be achieved. And here I extracted one quote from Sustainable Sydney, which is the overarching urban strategy. And I want you, while reading through this, not only to see how public art is embedded in the urban strategic discourse, but also to see how it is advocated through institutionalized forms of knowledge. And what I mean by that is the normative concepts such as sustainable city, creative city, global cities, which actually express what logic the city is using for the developmental logic of planning that the city is using. So global city, creative city, sustainable city, they are international concepts. But when a government decided to adopt them locally, we know what are their aims or what the agenda will be. So sustainable city is more about this balance between the environment, the economic, and the social aspect. Creative city is about bringing art and artists to the public domain, and so on. So Another interesting thing about the case of the City of Sydney, that they have a public art team, and this public art team is lodged under the urban design unit, which is an urban planning unit. And this means that the urban planning unit is involved in the commissioning of public art. So within the context of the City of Sydney, what I did to examine the public art making, I selected 3 different urban renewal sites with different typologies, with different characteristics, and at least 1 or more public art commissioned within these sites by the local government, by the City of Sydney. So in this slide, I'm showing the different urban renewal sites that I have selected. And I also found that each one of this, I'll just move to the next slide. Within each site, we could see that public art is linked to a different strategic direction and to a different objective that links also to the same strategic direction. So for example, in the first site, the Green Square Town Centre, the institutional discourse reveals that making public art in such major urban developments where the City of Sydney is involved in constructing community facilities or landscape projects or any other major projects where funded by capital budget, these public artworks, they are linked to a global and innovative city. So the objective of making public art in this particular space is to contribute to the economic, cultural, and competitiveness of the site. While in another site, which is Zhang Street South Precinct, which is a vacant land, developers are not yet involved in, or they didn't yet started doing the projects. The City of Sydney engaged artists to create a conceptual plan, not art as an object, but a conceptual plan that will guide the form and uses of the public spaces and the spatial elements that will be incorporated within this site. What does this mean? This means that the city, through this public artwork, is trying to engage the community and to balance or to use public art as instrumental in achieving a balance between the social needs and the private developers' needs. So when the artists come and do the community participation, they can incorporate all these needs in the plan, and then the city would implement them once these spaces are in the design process. The last one, which is the livable and the city center. The city center is a developed, spaces within the city center are almost developed. So the engagement of the artist here is for a different purpose and linked to a different strategic direction, which is a livable and engaging city and a cultural and creative city. So mainly the engagement of artists here is to reactivate or revitalize underperforming places, like for example, the laneways. So many programs actually, they target those places for reactivation purposes. But also to realize these strategic directions and these objectives, for each of these commissions, the City of Sydney adopts a different arrangements. And those arrangements, I looked at them because they tell us who is involved in the process, at what stage, is it before the design process or after? So all this information tell us about the power relations within the process and what roles or how the artist and other actors involved, they're connected to each other, or who has the power to do what and at what stage. Now, the most interesting part of the study is when I reached to analyzing the subjective discourses. So it's true that the City of Sydney, or the public art in the City of Sydney, is mainly linked to a strategic vision, and it's proposed by strategic objectives. But when I spoke to the actors involved in the process, I noticed 2 things. Subjects or actors within the process they define themselves in two forms. The first one is to define themselves in relation to the arrangements established by the institution. So for example, you find an artist saying, this is what the city wants, or the city of Sydney was very clear on what it wants, and we really just work to that. Or for example, a curator who prepares a specific strategy for public art, who said, I read all of them, referring to the relevant urban policies and strategies, and then incorporate them in creating curatorial themes for leading the public art commissioning in the city. So all of these discourses, when they appear, the chance of creating public art by means of strategy is very high. I mean, to be confined within what is established by the city of Sydney, or performing their visions and objectives, which is most of the public artworks, institutionalized public artworks is doing in other parts of the world. But the interesting part that many other actors in the process, and particularly the artists, because of their background and because they're educated, they're not educated to be like agents of the government, but they are educated as part of art theory, and for them creativity is a skill. They sound to be more radical, and they sound to be, or to define themselves in relation to the power and knowledge of the self. They are aware that their knowledge and their interpretation of the concepts or what is given to them is different from what they know, or they question it sometime, or they say, we want to take the risk and do something different. Or if, for example, an architect asks them to do a clock, they will interpret time in a completely different way and create an object that takes environmental data, let's say, and then propose it or archive it, and over time it will be like documented and could be seen and used by the users of the place in a very artistic way. Or for example, when the landscape designer asks, or when the strategy asks for public artwork that contribute to water management, and then the artists create or propose to bring bottle trees to solve this problem, it's out of the box solution. So when we see artists questioning or taking the risk or trying to appropriate and taking a critical stance toward what is given to them, this means that the institutional arrangements are not simply imposed on them, or it is flexible enough to allow this creativity to flourish and happen. And this is actually where I see the greatest potential out of my study. Public art making, and here I'm not concerned about the public art outcome, whether we like it or we don't like it as a final outcome, but as the process itself, as a process that has all of these tensions happening in the city politics. Because we all know as planners that what we see in cities is actually a reflection of what happens in city planning, in city politics and planning. So when we have a process like public art, where different actors are just having all these negotiations about they're given this space, let's say, we're creating a climate within our city politics that is conducive to new ideas. And I totally agree here with Sandercock, who said, it would be safe to say that nothing new enters the world without a certain amount of risk-taking on someone's part. But risk-taking by itself is useless without creativity, without new ideas about how to do things. And I think public art making as a process allows for this space within the city planning. And that's why I'm someone who think that institutionalization of public art could potentially be a benefit rather than something that we could argue against it. I think it's benefiting urban planning in a way or another. And thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Rana, for your presentation. Again, very, very good to time. We've probably got time for maybe one question that's a live question, and I would encourage everyone who is on the call at the moment, if you've got questions that we don't manage to get to or that you think about in the next few days, please get in touch with us speakers. It's always difficult when we've got 2 or 3 presentations at once to try and get a full scope of the audience's thoughts. So maybe one question for Rana live, and hopefully a lot of questions for Rana offline.
Maybe I'll ask one. Just
Thanks,
so
Lee.
stay at time. I'm just curious that it's interesting to have this conversation while Vivid is going on here in Sydney, and I'm just wondering about you mentioned some temporary events or temporary installments, and I think that's an interesting. I'm wondering if you think there's more ability to boundary push or be radical in situations where it is a temporary event, and how you see that affecting urban planning or urban renewal projects as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, there was no time to speak about details, but temporary, when I studied the city center projects, which are temporary projects, because they are temporary and because the site is developed and because the actors involved, they don't have like any other professionals like architects or those who are involved in a design process and would be given the primacy to talk about like or to negotiate the public art attributes. Artists, they tend to be more risk takers and to test new ideas because of all these arrangements. And that's why looking at institutional arrangements is very important, because it gives you an idea whether artists are enabled or maybe there are more constraints given the conditions, under what conditions they are operating. So temporary public art, the fact that it is temporary, it gives both actually the artist and the government this risk-taking and experimenting attitude toward when they do the commissioning public art. They allow for it, and they encourage it actually in such in such pathways.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the question, Lee, and thanks again, Rana, for your presentation.
Thank you.
We will get on to our last presenter for this afternoon, Joe Harvey, who's another PhD candidate at City Futures. Joe is supervised by Professor Susan Thompson and Professor Emerita Linda Corkery, and the title of his presentation today is Public and Private Green Space Use by Young Families in the City and Implications for the Future. Joe has the unfortunate circumstance of being the last speaker, and we are probably going to run a little bit over 5, so please stay online if you can for the end of the talk, and for Joe to probably wrap up around 5 or 10 past 5. Thanks very much.
I'll do my best.
Thank you, Joe. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. So there's 3 sections to my presentation today. A little bit about my research project and some context to the rest of the discussion. Thematic analysis and discussing that as a method or / methodology, and my approach to that thematic analysis. So my research project began in 2018 with my wife and I raising our then 2, now 3 daughters in an apartment in inner Sydney. As the primary carer in our family and no close relatives nearby, I came to appreciate the importance of speaking with our other parents to almost check in and in some way crowdsource the best parenting tips on this new journey for us. At the same time, with my background of 20 years in residential landscape construction and a degree in landscape architecture, a concept which appeared in some of my own reading around green space and health struck a chord with our own personal situation. That was green space compensation hypothesis, which is generally understood to refer to residents with poorer access to private green space, increasing their use of public green space to meet the benefits they require from green space use. A few existing studies that refer to this concept, however, are generally quantitative in nature, examining concepts such as time spent in green space, willingness to pay for access to green space, and number of visits to green space over certain time periods. From this, my research project was born. I've taken a case study approach using the suburb of Waitara, a suburb 20 kilometres to the north of Sydney CBD. and including features such as experiencing urban consolidation, still possessing a mix of housing types with a variety of private green space access, families living across those housing types, and experiencing in-demand public green space. Essentially, following a 1994 LEP, there's a specific 25-hectare area within my case study site, about 1/8 of the overall site, that has seen massive increase in density, where over the last 10 to 15 years, this style of development is common. This has led to the development of this research question. In light of urban consolidation effects, how does the green space compensation hypothesis manifest in the perceptions and experiences of public green spaces among families with children under 12 with varying access to private green space in Waitara, Sydney? I've taken a sequential mixed methods approach, initially completing a letterbox drop of flyers across the case study site to recruit for a mobile phone-based survey. This was 2021, so fortunately for me, QR codes were now something that everyone understood. I used the results of this survey for recruitment for my interviews and assistance in question generation for this next stage. That next stage was 17 online semi-structured interviews with primary carers. I was initially aiming for a mix of housing types, or actually private green space access types. However, I ended up with almost entirely apartment living families being represented. This means I probably still have one more phase of data collection specific to primary carers within my case study site, living in freestanding houses. So having completed these interviews, it was time for my analysis, and without necessarily knowing the full extent of my decision, I embarked on coming to grips with thematic analysis. Anyone with a passing interest in thematic analysis will most likely be referred to this article by Brown and Clark from 2006, which now has over 160,000 citations on Google Scholar. However, having read a fair bit of their work now and watched many of their lectures online, I can report they're very keen for greater understanding of what thematic analysis is, or at least has become. They are in some ways accidental famous methodologists, both primarily working in gender studies, but having come through the University of West of England psychology department together, completing their PhDs. They've continued to publish on thematic analysis to match their evolving understanding of the process. For instance, outside of their top reference, the next 11 most cited articles on Google Scholar by Virginia Brown are co-authored with Victoria Clark and are specific to thematic analysis. And most of these are much more relevant than the original 2006 article. This recent textbook in 2021 by them is, for me, a lifesaver, and I would recommend it to any qualitative researcher. They also have an excellent website run out of Auckland University of Technology, which is thematicanalysis.net, with great resources about thematic analysis for both students and supervisors and reviewers. One big feature of this up-to-date understanding of TA by Brown and Clark is the depiction of TA as being represented by three broad categories. Reflexive thematic analysis, which is what Brown and Clark now term their approach, is characterized by a flexible and organic coding process. Themes are produced, they don't emerge, they don't pre-exist analysis, and so they are viewed as analytic outputs generated from the codes. As such, researcher subjectivity and one's positionality are important elements in production of these themes via active engagement with the data. The approach aligns with a broadly qualitative research paradigm. In contrast, coding reliability approaches place a heavy emphasis on the measurement of coding accuracy or reliability. These approaches use a structured codebook and involve multiple independent coders. Themes are seen as analytic inputs developed early in the analytic process. These themes are often domain summaries collating all answers to specific questions. For example, the benefits of X or the limitations of Y. This approach is underpinned by more positivist assumptions. And lastly, codebook approaches such as template analysis, framework analysis, and matrix analysis sit on a continuum between coding reliability approaches and reflexive thematic analysis. They use a structured codebook similar to coding reliability approaches and consider themes as analytic inputs and domain summaries. However, they don't concern themselves with measuring coding reliability, which pulls them closer to reflexive thematic analysis. These approaches, therefore, also share a broadly qualitative philosophy or paradigm. Another important distinction for TA by Brown and Clark is that it is theoretically flexible, but not atheoretical. Brown and Clark therefore specify the importance of researchers using TA to explicitly state ontological and epistemological stances underpinning their research projects and encouraging understanding what these decisions mean in terms of selection of one specific TA approach. They outline 6 broad phases to their approach, and so I'll just finish by taking you through my process of these 6 recursive phases and look at the themes that I've produced from my interviews. I began with a Microsoft Teams transcript as all my interviews were completed online. I found there was just enough errors in my transcript that meant the editing process required a good level of interaction to begin that data familiarization phase. I then printed the transcripts and completed 3 different readings of the entire data set, each pass having a different coloured pen and a different aim for coding the data. On the 3rd pass, I was also creating code labels and code descriptions of each label in Excel. So for instance, a code label would be the short handwritten note that I'll be putting in some of my transcripts, but that could represent a few different interpretations of the data. Each interview would then have their own column in my Excel document, with each label type featuring in the interview having their own cell. What this step would allow me to do was to copy and paste direct from Excel into Miro, which is normally an online collaboration tool, but it also has sticky notes, which is a really useful digital tool for thematic analysis. I could then digitally organize my codes around these patterns of shared meaning, organized around a central concept. After a fairly messy process, similar to design for me, I ended up with this first draft as what has eventually become my thematic map. And as you can see, I have 5 specific themes that have come out from my interview of the, my 5 specific themes have been produced from my data analysis of the interview. There are 4 themes with 2 overarching concepts: escaping connection and shared social benefits. And the 5th theme related to COVID, which stands alone, but also encompasses the other 4, as it includes reference to these 4, but it's very specific to the time period the interviews took place within. And I'll take you briefly through these 5 themes with an example quote used to illustrate part of each theme. So the first theme is public green spaces colouring grey routine. Public green spaces are seen as indispensable retreats from daily stresses. These spaces bolster mental and emotional health by fostering connections with nature. Participants frequently emphasise the refreshing impact of green spaces on mental health, particularly during periods of stress. Furthermore, these spaces provide an escape from the monotony of work and school life at a variety of timescales. They are viewed as much needed respite from screen time. They also offer physical health benefits through opportunities for outdoor activities in space that may not be otherwise available. And the example quote for that I have here is, use it to like refresh, as in like when you're inside, as I said, 5 days a week. 5 days in a week I'm working in an office. So even though I'm working sometimes, working from home, I'm still continuously like 8 to 9 hours. And then we just do our daily routine, dinner, go back to sleep again, wake up in the morning, repeat that same for the next 5 days. Same happens with my son. He has to go to school. He has to do his routine homework, say his classes, and then again, same routine for everybody in the house. Now, to get out of that monotonous routine, you have 2 days where you can just relax, and basically when you go out, you kind of forget what you've been doing for the past week and you enjoy being out. The second theme is public green spaces social glue. So participants highlighted the crucial role of public green spaces in nurturing social connections and fostering community development. Participants view these spaces as platforms for intentional social interactions that help break the isolation often experienced in private spaces. These spaces provide opportunities to meet new people and establish friendships, also serving as neutral grounds for regular social catch-ups with existing friends. Furthermore, they promote a sense of shared responsibility and pride, with the collective care of these spaces strengthening the sense of community and fostering a sense of belonging. And the example quote for that is, really, to be honest, I really like these communities, this area in Waitara, because they're quite dynamic. I like, that even, we've got a big population or high population here and density is quite high. But really, I enjoy, sometimes, you feel like, it's very dynamic. You see a lot of new people, and when you go downstairs outside and you meet different people, you just discuss where you are from and what's your job, and then new people. There are so many people to meet. Theme 3 is public green space as preferred alternative. Public green spaces are highly valued as alternatives to private green spaces. They provide relief and enjoyment of established greenery and diverse flora without the responsibilities and costs of maintenance. These spaces offer a wide variety of amenities that enhance their appeal, catering to those who prefer the simplicity of apartment living. In this context, community gardens are praised for fostering a sense of shared space and collective responsibility. However, overcrowding in public spaces is noted as a drawback, sometimes limiting play opportunities. Cultural differences are also noted regarding the desire for public versus private spaces. With the quote being, yeah, if you're into that kind of thing, and if you're okay expending that, I mean, if you have time in that period of your life to expend labour in maintaining those plants, it's absolutely fine, but having a growing family and a full-time job, By the end of the week, you're like, oh, okay, just let me sit for a while, right? So, but maybe in the later stage of life, you know, when kids are grown up, you don't need to tend to them all the time and they do their own thing. Then you may have a little garden in your own backspace where you take, I don't know, happiness and pride in growing a plant. And, you know, I mean, like harvesting your labor, basically, like at least have some decorative plants and think about how to tend to them, how to maintain them, how to make them grow better. So that can become a hobby for some people. But yeah, at least for me at this point in time in my life, we don't have that much time to look after a garden. So for me, it's if everything is set up already, you just go over there and sit and look at it, especially in Hornsby. If you go to the Aquatic Centre Park, there are a lot of flowers, you know, flowers and plants there. It's really nice to look at. And also the birds coming in, to just sit there and, you know, just relax for a while for 10 to 15 minutes. That's fine, right? Theme 4 is public green space as family anchor. Public green spaces are seen as essential for family bonding and relaxation. Drawing from their own childhood experiences, parents reflected on striving to recreate similar nature encounters for their children. These spaces offer a break from daily routines and stimulate children's curiosity. The family composition plays a role in how green spaces are interacted with. Parks close to schools and daycare centres are appreciated for their convenience, and shared hobbies like balcony gardening promote quality family time. Planning of visits is mindful of avoiding overcrowding and ensuring age-appropriate spaces and timing. And the example quote I have for that theme is, yes, it's de-stressing. It helps me connect with this place, and it's something that we all feel that it helps us connect as a family. You have more time. It's a better setting for conversing, not distracted by electronics where you know that you do not have a TV too. We can be curious, inquisitive. You ask more questions, especially my child. She asks me more questions when she's out than when she's at home because she sees new things. She's interested in them. So yeah, that's what it brings. And of course, it does help you de-stress from the work, physical and mental. You try to, you know, take away the stress of your work. You take away the stress on your eyes and your body of the weekly work and you do it together. So yeah, multiple ways. And the last theme, as I mentioned, is public green spaces, COVID respite. During the COVID-19 pandemic, green spaces provided an essential escape and safe place for physical activity. Families sought fresh air, sunlight, and exercise in local parks, and lockdowns ignited a newfound appreciation for nearby green spaces. However, crowded parks became less favourable due to health concerns, leading participants to seek out less frequented areas. Notably, post-lockdown changes were observed in the usage of green spaces and community engagement, with some previously improvised facilities falling into disuse. With the example quote being, I mean, it's like, I am inside the unit. You don't get that kind of air or light, you can say. And specifically when in the COVID times, like I was very much cautious and I was very much following all the rules and regulations and trying to be at home as much as possible. So there were days where we were not going out for weeks, like going to the balcony and that's all. And we used to just order everything online from Coles or Woolies and it used to get delivered at home. So I believe that in those times, I would love to go and just have some kind of fresh air. I would go to our shared green space. And specifically in my case, because my unit doesn't get much of the sun, I can go there and if there's a good sunlight out, I can go out and sort of get that warmth and light and air just for a bit. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you for sticking to time and being actually a little faster than 15 minutes. So very appreciated. Before we get to questions for Joe, I was just hoping to ask everyone who is online at the moment to unmute themselves and give our three speakers a round of applause, because it's weird being online, and if they were in person, we would give everyone a round of applause. So thank you very much. I'm not sure if you can hear the clapping. If you want to do emojis of clapping, that would be great. But please make your appreciation known for all speakers. There's Hazel in the background, lots of emojis coming through. I will take one live question for Joe, and then hopefully some good engagement from the audience offline for our three speakers. Does anyone have a question for Joe? There may be one in the chat.
I'll jump in if nobody else has one. And I'm just curious, Joe, it's your interviews are like exactly my experience during COVID with my child as well. So I can really hear myself in those quotes. But I'm wondering, you know, are you doing follow-up, kind of post-COVID follow-up to see, you know, for instance, the idea of public space as glue, as social glue? Do you see that continuing post-COVID, or is that sort of falling away as we get back to the gym or whatever else?
So from memory, the the time that I interviewed them was just before what was a second lockdown, I think, for the local area. And so to them, the interviews were taking place in what was quite a free period, even though now looking back on it, that was still very much a COVID time. At the moment, my intention going forward is that I still have more interviews to, like I said, complete, but with people who have access to their own private green space. I'm not sure if both my supervisors here noticed that I included the possibility of a quality of online survey. That I haven't brought that up with them yet, but there's going to be some version of trying to find these people that I know exist that I didn't, for some reason, manage to attract into my initial interview cohort. But yeah, I'm overall, I'm still working out the best approach to actually make sure that my research is solving the question that I set out to solve, and still doing it with that qualitative sense, because I think there is something to be said for going and finding rich data, distinct from needing, and I think when I first started the process, needing to find two distinct groups and being able to compare it against each other. And I think I still have some of that left over in my thinking, and I think that I'm still trying to resolve that level of needing to go and find these other people that have access to private green space and knowing what I'm going to do with that. My intention is that I'll be taking the themes that I've produced from this initial phase and using that to further discussion with people who have access to their own private green space, just to see what sort of data can be created through that process as well, as opposed to necessarily comparing one versus the other. But yeah, not sure that really necessarily answers your question, Lee. But
great, thanks.
Well, please join me again in thanking our three speakers, Yunzheng, Rana, and Zhou. Thank you to the people asking questions. Special shout out to Lee.
And I'm just going to jump in and say a big thank you to you, Charlie, for facilitating the whole event, and also to Ali, because she did our advertising. But thank you very, very much to our three postgraduate students and to everyone who's been here at the event. So great. Thanks so much.
And thanks to the audience for staying behind a little bit on a Friday afternoon. So we'll let you go to your weekend. Thank you very much for staying online. And please, as I said, get in touch with our speakers offline. I'm sure there are plenty of questions that have come out of this, and we just haven't had time to give the full scope of questions that I'm sure people had. So thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. See you in 2 weeks.